Hello again, welcome to General Psychology, Psychology 101, and today we're going to be talking about the biology of psychology, specifically the neural and hormonal systems. So, biological psychology takes the perspective that everything that we do as human beings, every time we think, we feel, we behave, it can be traced to some kind of biological origins. And this biological perspective really focuses in on the interplay between biology, behavior, and the mind. When we talk about biology, you can probably think about this as, think about any other biology class you've taken, is that we are a bunch of systems composed of smaller systems, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the especially important systems when we think about the influence of biology on psychology, on the mind, is that of the neural system, thinking about neural communication. And much of the research that's done on neural communication focuses on animal research, whether it be using rats or using rabbits. The neural systems in these animals is extremely similar to that of humans. So in order to safeguard, talked about research on human subjects, in order to safeguard the human life, so to speak, much of the research is conducted on animals. So what about the neural system is interesting in terms of psychology? So let's first kind of delve down into the neural system, and the building blocks of the neural system are neurons. These are everywhere in the human body, especially in the brain, and these are building blocks of the information system. So within each neuron we have branching fibers or dendrites that receive information, whether it be from other neurons or other sources. This information then comes together into the cell body, passes through the axon into other areas. The axon is insulated by what's known as the myelin sheath. This is fatty tissue. The more insulated it is, the quicker messages can pass through the axon, and then out into the terminal branches of the axon. And this is where messages then are able to pass to other neurons and pass through the body very quickly to pass on information. When do we pass on these messages? Well, sometimes it's the case that neurons are stimulated by signals from our senses. If we touch something, that information passes on from our fingertips to our brain so we understand what we're touching. It can sometimes be due to receiving other chemicals from other neurons. If we want to think about something or pass information from the brain to our hands in order to make a specific movement, that's an example of the message passing on through multiple different neurons. And the way neurons pass these messages from one neuron to another, or from one side of a neuron to the other side, is through what's known as an action potential. That basically means that there are negative ions inside the neuron. At resting potential, neurons are negatively charged. And when a neuron fires, that means that positive ions are let inside the neuron. They flood inside. That depolarizes the neuron. And then because it depolarizes, you see this kind of jump in potential. And then at that point, the neuron then pumps these positive ions back outside to allow it to become negatively charged again. And this kind of moves along the axon, this kind of bump, this action potential, slowly moves along as the different sections of the axon become more positively charged and pump back out the positive ions as the message slowly travels down the axon. When do we see this action potential occur? Well, once a certain threshold is passed of the amount of positive ions that are let into an axon. It's basically an all or none response. As soon as the threshold is passed, then we see the action potentially fired. There's really nothing more that can occur if the threshold continues to be passed. So what happens when the message or the action potential reaches the end of the axon, the terminal branches of the axon? Well, it reaches a synapse. And a synapse is basically the gap between one neuron and another. Neurons don't actually touch. There's a little 1/1,000,000th of an inch wide gap in between neurons. This gap is known as the synaptic cleft. And what happens is that neurotransmitters are released from one end of the axon and then picked up by the dendrites. And these neurotransmitters basically tell each neuron how to behave. Maybe they let certain atoms in, and different neurotransmitters can have different interactions with axons. So we can think about serotonin, dopamine. These are all examples of neurotransmitters that each do different things. Sometimes it can lead to anxious feelings. Sometimes it can help arouse individuals. The specific neurotransmitter that is released into the synaptic cleft depends on the goal of the transmission or the message or the action potential. Along with neurotransmitters leading to specific responses in the human body, we can also see certain drugs mimic exactly how neurotransmitters behave. So for example, we have the drug morphine. It tends to mimic what our natural endorphins do. That's to kind of stimulate and arouse us into specific behaviors. You have to be careful with these drugs that are used as substitutes for neurotransmitters, because if we keep taking these drugs, our body can be accustomed to the drugs and not naturally produce the neurotransmitters that we need to survive. So drugs should only be used if it's absolutely necessary for them to be used. They shouldn't be used as a substitute for these neurotransmitters that help us function in daily life. So all of these millions and billions of neurons come together to form our nervous system. And there are two main subsections of our nervous system that do pretty much different things. Our central nervous system is composed of our brain and our spinal cord, and these combine to be the body's decision maker. These make all the important decisions that we as human beings think of in our daily life. We have at least 40 billion neurons in our brain, and these often cluster into neural networks to help make certain processes more efficient. Maybe certain neurons are dedicated to performing certain tasks, such as knowing how to sit down, or maybe knowing how to read a book, or remembering what our name is. And these clusters are devoted to these tasks if we perform them frequently enough. With the spinal cord, this is basically a two-way information highway from our central nervous system to our peripheral nervous system, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And this highway often facilitates what are commonly known as knee-jerk responses. So if you tap your patella tendon, your knee is going to automatically kick out. This is an example of an automatic response or reflex. You can also think of a startle reflex. If you're scared, you're going to immediately kind of spread out. These are examples of some of the responses that are characteristic of our central nervous system. Alternatively, the peripheral nervous system are all the other neurons that connect to the rest of the body, connect the central nervous system to all of our other appendages. And these neurons, for the most part, gather information. So a great example of nerves that are part of the peripheral nervous system are optic nerves. So these collect sensory information, specifically visual sensory information, and then send that to the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Within the peripheral nervous system, we have two separate subsections. The somatic nervous system allows for voluntary control. So these nerves focus on, how do we send messages from the brain to our limbs and other body parts that allow us to move around. And alternatively, the autonomic nervous system controls a lot of the stuff that we can't explicitly control, such as our glands or the muscles in our organs. Within the automatic nervous system, we can have both a sympathetic nervous system and a parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system focuses on arousal and uses up energy for some reason. So maybe our stomach needs to digest food, so that would be an example of the sympathetic nervous system at work. And then the parasympathetic nervous system calms and conserves energy. So once we've digested that food, it basically sends messages to the stomach to tell it, all right, you can rest now. You don't have to work hard on digesting food. And there are a lot of different neurons that can compose our peripheral nervous system. Sensory neurons, again, are collecting information from our tissues and our sensory receptors, and sending them to the central nervous system. Motor neurons are sending messages from our brains to our muscles to tell them what to do. And interneurons are basically connecting all of these other sections together, making sure that everything is running as smoothly and efficiently as possible. So that's our neural system. What about our hormonal systems? These are governed by what's known as the endocrine system. And these consist of glands that can secrete hormones that travel through our bloodstream to other tissues. And these hormones basically act in a similar way as neurotransmitters, but through the bloodstream rather than through the nervous system, so to speak. These send messages, tell our glands what to do, how to behave. And for the most part, our endocrine system is much slower than the nervous system, but our messages can last a lot longer. So some of our more important glands, especially when thinking about how these relate to psychology, are our adrenal glands. These are located just above the kidneys, and these glands secrete hormones that help arouse the body. So if we think about how the endocrine system again, has messages that last a little bit longer. These messages will arouse the body, help us get ready to prepare for something in the environment. And after it's occurred, it will last a little bit longer. We'll still have this arousal in our body. We'll still feel a little hopped up on adrenaline, again, adrenal glands, even after the specific environmental cue may have already disappeared. So maybe we see a tiger in the jungle. Our adrenal glands help us to get aroused, to get ready for fight or flight. And then after the tiger leaves, we still feel that little bit of fight or flight, even though the environmental stimulus is gone. Another gland that's extremely important in psychology is the pituitary gland. This is located in the core of the brain, small little area. It's controlled by the hypothalamus, and it regulates both growth and basically has its hand in controlling other glands in the endocrine system. And for that reason, the pituitary gland is often considered the master gland. So there are a bunch of different glands, a bunch of different organs, a bunch of different connections between both our brain and not only internal organs, but external organs and our muscles that are governed by our brain. Our brain is very important, and we'll get into talking about the brain in just a moment. So that's all I have for the moment. Thank you all for your time and attention, and I will see you again soon. Thanks.